Rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljoradnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada. Mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvom rudaru i tvome rataru, mir graditelju i tvom čuvaru, mir tvojoj sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Srcem Tita, rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita.
มาเต็มที่ดินแดนแห่งนี้สู้ตีลังกาเรือน้ำโลได้ท่าแนวหัวแนวห้องเสียวสาราสู่สนป่าแพร่ไปลีเก็บทอดปล่อยนี้จะรักษาศาสตร์ศรีเอราสมีไปในทั่วแดนลาว
L'estro
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the afternoon of November the 27th, 2024, and we come to you today with what will become a episode of Decline and Fall with our friend and regular collaborator, Kit Clarenberg. He'll be coming up later on. But I wanted to start a little bit early to deal with questions from the audience and also the story that has sort of emerged over the last few days of the ceasefire that is apparently being enforced with regards to the front between Hezbollah, or I should say, the Lebanese National Liberation Forces, and the colonial forces of U.S. imperialism that call themselves Israel. And this was a story that emerged over the past couple of days, and it is essentially, from what I have read so far, a restatement of the UN resolution that ended the war of 2006 and brought in, of course, UNIFIL. I think is their official title, the UN forces that the Israelis have been periodically shooting at over the last few months, and was meant to, of course, ensure that there was a withdrawal of Lebanese National Liberation Forces, or Hezbollah as they are more commonly known, to the north of the Litani River. And this was, of course, a demand that Netanyahu was shouting and screaming about. But, of course, this was a demand that he wasn't getting, nor could he achieve. The Biden administration has apparently now acted to put at least a temporary halt to the war in southern Lebanon. Primarily, it would seem, because the war in southern Lebanon was going very, very badly for the US side, and the Israeli forces, or I should to give them their more accurate title, the US colonial forces, were losing a hell of a lot of armor. According to most estimates, they had lost around about 60 to 62 Merkava tanks on the northern front in just over 2 months of fighting. So this is an astonishing rate of loss. They had barely advanced just over a mile, or 3 kilometers or so, depending upon which estimate you look at, into Lebanese territory. They were losing a lot of men. They were bombing, of course, a lot of civilian areas of southern Lebanon mainly, and Beirut, causing a lot of destruction, causing a lot of death. But militarily, they were doing no better than they did in 2006, and arguably worse. And for these reasons, and for reasons of, I think, a hell of a lot of overstretch for the U.S. forces, not just the colonial Israeli forces, but also the U.S. Navy and Air Force, with its large presence covering or trying to cover the Red Sea, their failed actions to counteract the Red Sea blockade put in place by the Yemeni forces led by Ansar Allah, the fact that the Israelis are running low, apparently on weapons, and the US is struggling to keep them supplied. For all those reasons, it would seem that the US imperialists reach a conclusion that this had better be shut down now. And thus, they apparently gave the order to Netanyahu. Now, it should be stressed that this, politically speaking for Netanyahu, may well be fatal, given that he has had to go out and twist the arm of Bezalel Smotrich to vote for this in the Israeli cabinet. Itmar Ben-Gvir, the wild man, the lunatic, has voted against it. So it could well be that this costs Netanyahu his administration, because what has been revealed is that the US imperialists and their man on the spot, their regional manager Netanyahu, made a very severe miscalculation with regard to the strength in depth of Hezbollah. They fought, and I think that this is quite genuine in terms of what their analysis was. They imagined that if they did the pager attacks, which had been a work in progress for quite some time, it would have taken many months to set that up, to set up like a fake supply chain, a front company that would be run by Israel or Israeli intelligence, to be more accurate, to get these pagers into the hands of various people inside the Hezbollah, both military and but largely civilian structures. And then, of course, follow that up by the mass assassination campaigns that they waged upon the Hezbollah leadership, including, of course, Secretary General of Hezbollah, as was Hassan Nasrallah. They seem to think that the sowing of this chaos, the pager attack, which was apparently planned to be much worse than it eventually was, followed by the decapitation strategy of the Hezbollah leadership, would be enough to secure chaos in the Hezbollah ranks and therefore make the task of an Israeli ground invasion much easier. This seems to have been the calculation that they were making. So what they took away from last time, from 18 years ago in 2006, was that they needed to disrupt Hezbollah command and control systems much more than they did back in 2006. So the plan was to inflict this disorientating series of strikes upon the Hezbollah command system, including the decapitation strategy, then do the invasion of southern Lebanon, followed by, of course, intensive bombing of civilian areas. And that would throw Hezbollah into chaos and would enable the Israelis to obtain their objectives on the battlefield, because the structure of Hezbollah would be compromised. There would be all kinds of chaos in the ranks. There would be fear and suspicion of internal agents of Israeli intelligence and American intelligence having penetrated the senior levels of Hezbollah to be able to get intelligence on the location of Hassan Nasrallah and other leaders. So this was the calculation that they were making. Now, this calculation has proven to be wrong. It was erroneous. The pager attacks and the assassination of Nasrallah, and again many other senior leaders, did not appear to overly disrupt Hezbollah's operations on the battlefield. In fact, it seems to have, and I await for further reporting on this, because there might be other details that we don't know about as of yet. But what it appears to be the case is that Hezbollah's command structure was much more deep and much more organized and much more durable than the US and their Israeli stooges thought. So that even the assassination of the General Secretary of Hezbollah and a lot of his comrades at the most senior level failed to seriously disrupt the organization in a way that would have compromised them on the battlefield. So for all that the death and destruction that the US imperialists inflicted, they were unable to uproot Hezbollah from their well-entrenched defensive positions in southern Lebanon. So this must go down as a failure and a defeat for the US imperialists themselves, because let's not allow them to do what they are clearly intending to do here, which is pin the entire thing on Netanyahu and the senior leadership in Israel itself, blame them, secure the end of Netanyahu's political career, because they're determined to pin it all on him, throw him under the bus. Maybe they won't be putting him on trial in Israel. He knows too much after all, but pension him off and send him to Florida would probably be their option that they would take. And pin it all on him, Golan, the military leadership, say that whatever excesses that were committed were all their fault, wasn't Biden's fault, wasn't the US's fault. They didn't know what was going on. Poor old Biden, he was confused. And essentially then bring in a new political leadership in Israel itself, and essentially try then to get back to the strategy that both Trump and Biden were pursuing in West Asia, which is to essentially emasculate the axis of resistance by signing normalization deals with Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, and other Arab comprador regimes. Now, this strategy again is, I think, proving to be bankrupt, because all that Trump and Biden were really doing with those normalization deals was bringing out into the open what we all knew. Anybody who'd done any reading on West Asia knew very well was the case with regard to the Saudi regime, the Qatari regime, and the other Gulf state regimes, places like Oman, which is that all of them have very extensive relations with the Israeli regime, have done for many, many years. And not only that, that all of these countries, all of these comprador regimes are, if not direct puppets of US imperialism, are very close allies with it and are bulwarks of reaction in West Asia, all the way through the period of the Cold War and afterwards. These are ultra-reactionary, elitist regimes that have sided with US imperialism for many decades, and before that, British imperialism. In fact, many of them are creations of British imperialism. So the normalization deals just brought out into the open what everybody knew was there anyway. But this has been thrown into chaos by October the 7th, by Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, by what is and should be regarded as a US defeat in the Red Sea, and now a US, via Israel, defeat against Hezbollah. They've failed to uproot Hezbollah. They've failed to destroy its command structures. It is a much more deeply rooted and much more well-organized group, and much more durable in terms of its presence in Lebanon, and with a much wider appeal than inside Lebanese society. So an appeal that goes far beyond the southern Lebanese Shia Muslims, where Hezbollah, of course, originated from. It has a presence and an appeal to the Sunni Muslims in Lebanon and to the Christian population as well, certain elements of the Christian population who work with it. And there are now more broad national liberation forces fighting alongside the Shia core of Hezbollah. So if the US imperialist strategy was to try and uproot Hezbollah, to try and turn even the Shia population against it, and especially try to turn the Christian and the Sunni Muslim population against it, this all failed. And what you've actually ended up with is the securing martyrdom status for Hassan Nasrallah and many others, in a way that their memory and their legacy will be respected by people far beyond the Shia population. And they've discovered that Hezbollah represents a quite genuine national liberation movement in Lebanon, which is much more, is about much more than just resisting Israel, though of course that is a central part to it. It is really about securing the liberation of Lebanon from its status as a neo-colonial American dependency, which is what it has been reduced to since the end of the Lebanese Civil War, the formal end of the Lebanese Civil War. So a failure of US imperialism. Apparently, the Biden gang threatened Netanyahu to get him to agree to this. They basically said, if you do not agree to this, then we will lift our objections to a UN resolution going through, which would essentially place an arms embargo on Israel. And that was enough to get Netanyahu to back down. So it just goes to show, if this does indeed prove to be what was said, that the Biden administration could have ended this in 24 hours. They could have ended the war in Gaza in 24 hours. But, of course, the reason why they have not done that, the reason why they wanted to avoid that, was twofold. First of all, the US imperialists have a clear and identifiable interest in crushing the axis of resistance in West Asia. So crushing Hamas, crushing Hezbollah, crushing and destroying the Syrian government, and ultimately the Iranian government. That is a constant objective. It doesn't matter whether it's Obama or Trump or Biden or Trump again, or what personnel they have around them. It has been an objective of US imperialism, the imperialists require all forms of resistance to be absolutely extirpated. And they were more than happy to have the Israeli regime go on a rampage on their behalf, fully supported by them logistically and in terms of intelligence provision. Both the US and the British government, it is very well documented now by, in the British case, by sites like Declassified UK and the reporting of people like Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis, that the British have been lending their assistance to the Israeli regime in terms of intelligence provision all the way through this. US has been supplying Israel to a massive extent through all of this. Israel couldn't have done all that it has done if it was not working in the service of US imperialism. And when things started to go severely wrong, suddenly US imperialism called time on the events in the campaign in Lebanon, having decided this was going badly wrong. Now, so the reason why they didn't stop it on day one was partly for those reasons, and there's a more broad reason as well, which is the preservation of the Israeli regime. Now, many US presidents, I think probably including Trump himself, can't stand Netanyahu, don't like dealing with him, find him to be an arsehole of epic proportions. But of course, personal feelings don't come into this, not really, when it comes to the strategic interests of US imperialism and British imperialism. Just because you think that the guy at the top in the colonial dependency is an arsehole doesn't necessarily mean you're going to abandon the project. It might affect, decisions further on down the line, but strategically it has no bearing. So the decision to stick by and stick with the Israeli regime and allow it to do this bloody work in Gaza and in Lebanon is a decision motivated by the fact that if the Israeli regime had its activities curtailed, would have caused severe internal problems within the politics of Israel, for all the reasons we have gone through before. Netanyahu might be a loathed figure, but he is the one man over the last 30 years who's been able to consistently pull together stable governments in Israel. The Israeli Labour Party has long since bitten the dust. I think it still exists in some form, but it's not the force it once was by any means, can't pull a government together anymore. Netanyahu has been the one who has made all the running, and that reflects long-term demographic changes in the Israeli system itself, which means that the long-term trend towards an ever more reactionary and ever more openly fascist politics in Israel was established as far back as the 70s with the triumph of Menachem Begin. The trick of Netanyahu and what he has been able to pull off is that he has consistently managed to expand the support base for his governments by tapping into the waves of settlers that arrive from other countries in West Asia, who arrived from the 50s through to the 90s, or through to the 80s, I should say, and they became the voting bloc on which Likud was built. Then the waves of settlers coming from the former Soviet nations, including Russia, then even more coming from the United States, all constituting like ultra-reactionary voting blocs, which Netanyahu has quite skillfully brought in to his coalition. So, man's a scumbag, but he's the one guy who has consistently understood the nature of the relationship with the US, I think, and also understood Israel's value to the US and been able to push that as far as he can in terms of his own ambitions. He also understands how to pull together these reactionary blocs and keep them together. Now, other than him, there's nobody who can really do it. The Israeli liberals are a diminishing force, and an Israeli liberal and an Israeli reactionary are basically the same thing. It's just that one would prefer liberal trappings, a liberal face being presented inside Israel and to the rest of the world. The ultra-reactionaries, the open fascists, the Kahanists, the religious lunatics in Israel, they are a bit more honest in their intentions. They some of them want outright religious rule. Some of them are prepared to just settle for being rabid colonialists and expanding Israel's borders with flimsy religious justifications. But they are the power in Israel. They're the ones who have been making all the running politically. And without them, then if they are not prepared to collaborate with an Israeli government, the forces of Israeli liberalism can't really pull together a stable government. So this is the dilemma facing US imperialism. It has allowed its stooge regime to go on this rampage, fully supplying it with weapons and intelligence. And this is, again, the reason why someone like Zelensky and his crew says that we want Ukraine to be a big Israel is because they want Israel. They want to play Israel's role as a beachhead for US imperialism in West Asia. They want to play that in Eastern Europe, particularly targeted at Russia primarily, but also at anybody around that area who might try and break out of the chokehold of US imperialism. So it's not just about Russia with regard to Ukraine, though they are, of course, the primary target at the moment. The long-term objective of the Ukrainian Bandera clique that runs things is to turn themselves into the Eastern European Israel, and to basically be used in the same way by US imperialism, because if you are prepared to do that, you will be handsomely rewarded. So they saw their role as being the guarantors of US imperialism's presence in Eastern Europe, principally against Russia. But also, if any government were to emerge in a place like Romania or even Poland that would seek to question the wisdom of tying their countries to the US imperialist system, well, then you could expect the Bandera regime in Kiev to play the same role for US imperialism that the Israeli regime has played towards those countries which seek to assert any real kind of sovereignty or independence in West Asia. This is the role that the Bandera regime in Kiev has in mind for itself, a role they will ultimately end up not playing, because as we will discuss when Kit Clarenberg comes on, that war is going stupendously badly, and it won't work out very well for them at all. But we will see how this ceasefire holds in West Asia. Whether it destroys Netanyahu's government, certainly it seemed that the lunatic fascist Ben Gvir is probably going to end up pulling out of his government. Smotrich, who seems to have been strong-armed into voting for this by both Netanyahu and by the US imperialists. The US imperialists, by the way, have all kinds of levers they can pull to make these guys fall into line. There's all kinds of, shall we say, material they will have on Netanyahu and perhaps his financial dealings and other things that he has done. There's all kinds of material that they have, doubtless, on people like Smotrich and various things he's been involved in. You can bet there's a whole file about 12 inches thick on all of these characters. And they will, the US imperialists will, when they want these guys to fall into line, subtly mention to them that there's various things that they could reveal, not directly, but through tame journalists. They could leak it to the press about various activities that Netanyahu has been involved in. They could leak it to the prosecuting authorities inside Israel itself and make life difficult for him that way. So there's all kinds of levers that the US could always pull on if it wanted to rein these guys in. They're just creatures of the US system. They're allowed to do what they do because it suits US imperialism to have them do what they do. So don't ever let US imperialism off the hook on this. The way that the Israelis have conducted themselves over the last 12 months is precisely because it is in the interests of the US ruling class, the US imperialists, to do as they have done. Now they're going to try and pin the whole thing on Netanyahu, and maybe some of the and Smotrich and Ben Gvir and maybe some senior Israeli officers. Oh well, this thing ran out of control. Excesses were committed. We didn't know. That bad guy Netanyahu, he did it all. But we shouldn't let them pin the whole thing on their Israeli regional management team. This was something that was, as much as the Kiev regime is their creation, and they run it and they control it, and they can pull its leash in at any time. The same is true of Israel. Yes, the Israeli sympathizers inside the US ruling class are much more long-standing and well-entrenched than their Ukrainian equivalents. That's true. But when the priorities of US imperialism at stake, the leash gets pulled. The Israeli regime is told, right, you're doing this now. And this goes back to the fake peace initiatives of Blinken and Biden and the other creatures in the US administration. These were never serious. These were PR initiatives, principally directed partially at the at Arab opinion, but principally this was for domestic political consumption. The Biden gang and the Democrats understood they had a severe political problem internally with regard to the presidential election. And so all of these tricks that they were engaged in, all of this theatre for the last 12 months about peace initiatives was principally for, there was an overarching objective to try and split up the axis of resistance forces. That was something they wanted to do. It didn't really work. But a lot of it was for domestic consumption. It was a manipulation, a pure manipulation, as they have just shown now. The way in which this has been done, with Netanyahu being forced into doing something which is very much against his political interests and could end up costing him his job, it just shows what they could have done at any point had they chosen to do so. The reason why they did not was because it is very much in the interests of US imperialism and the US ruling class to try and destroy the axis of resistance and completely subordinate Lebanon, rid themselves of the troublesome Hezbollah forever and all facets of resistance there. It was very much in their interest to do that, but they have run into a brick wall in southern Lebanon. They have discovered that the Iranian government and the Iranian system is not only durable, but is capable of reaching out and hurting the Israeli military. Never mind what they could potentially do to the US military presence inside West Asia. So 2-month ceasefire is apparently what is on the cards now. We'll see if that lasts, or if the Israeli regime keeps saying that they've retained the right to try and break that ceasefire. What's going to happen with Gaza is still an open question. I haven't seen an update on that. So I'll leave the comments on that there for now. We will get into the questions and comments here. Hello to James Graham, and hello to Veshna Pamet, hello to Nikki Konst, who wants to know what Mark Rutte was doing in Athens yesterday. Nothing good, I take it. I didn't know he was there, but I'll see if Kit's got anything to say on that when he comes on. Hello to Keon the Grey, who says, love the show. Any suggestions for non-polemical work on Marxism, Leninism versus Trotskyism? Well, the difficulty with that is that everything on that question is polemical to one degree or another, Kion. My suggestion, if you want to do a comparison, read the works of both. I mean, this is how I ultimately ended up doing it. Go and read Stalin's work. Go and read Foundations of Leninism. Go and read the work Trotskyism or Leninism. You can find that pretty easily on the Marxist Internet Archive. Then read the works of Trotsky himself and compare and contrast. You might find it useful to get hold of the book, Stalin's book On the Opposition, which I've been doing a regular program on, covering what he wrote in there, and compare it to the pronouncements of Trotsky throughout the 1920s. And then go and read the wider material on the role of Trotskyism in the 1930s from people like Grover Furr. Compare that to the publicly stated positions of Trotsky and the Trotskyites. That's the best way to do it. So, I mean, what I've described would be perhaps a rather long-winded process, but if you want to compare the two, compare the words and the deeds of both sides of this debate, Kion. That's my advice. I mean, that's the way I proceeded through it, not on purpose, but that's just the way it shook out for me. I spent many years as a Trotskyite reading everything I possibly could from Trotsky. Then when I started reading Stalin and started reading Mao, I became convinced that Trotsky's presentation of the issue had been at best partial, and that's when I went on the reading spree I've just described to you there. More Time Needed joins us from Skeggy on the East Coast Riviera. Good to have you with us. James Brock joins us from occupied Japan. Hello to Jerry. Hello to Davey. Hello to Victor. Hello to Anthony from Prague. Hello to Boris M, who joins us from the former Yugoslavia. But I'm convinced that Yugoslavia will re-emerge, Boris, in one form or another. The so-called dreams of the petty reactionaries in all of the Yugoslav former republics are slowly turning to ash. So I think that the once and future Yugoslavia is the term that we can use there. Hello to Anthony, who says, great news that the Czech Communist Party is back after 4 years outside Parliament and will fight next year's general election at the head of a coalition of left parties. Interesting development. We'll be sure to keep up with that. Hello to Grassy Knoll in Seattle, Washington. Hello to RVA Klavek in Detroit. Hello to Robeson, who joins us from Indonesia. Hello to Ben, who joins us from Hungary and says, can't take much more of this villainy with Hungarian names like Sebastian Gorka or Georgi Soros. Yes, well, Gorka, we will have him coming up later. Interesting article from Kit Klarenberg and Max Blumenthal, which we'll be discussing when Kit comes on. Hello to Svetlana, who joins us from Moscow. Hello to Christopher Rogers, joining us from Hong Kong, People's Republic of China. Hello to Clinton in London. Hello from Almir, who comes to us from the once and future Yugoslav Republic of Slovenia. And we've also got here Bishi Barnaby, comes to us from East Anglia. Grassy Knoll says Netanyahu stated that the ceasefire would give Israel an opportunity to focus on Iran. That's the work of a man trying to sell something. Because what can Israel do against Iran without the full backing of the US imperialists? Which would risk the forces of US imperialism themselves coming under direct attack, not just from Iran, but from resistance forces in Iraq and Syria, and also, of course, risking direct attack from Iran if the US imperialists try to go after Iran directly. The US actions with regard to Iran are restricted because Iran can hurt them. And it would be a huge risk for any US president to try some sort of crazy invasion of Iran. It would go very badly for them. So that's Netanyahu trying to sell a defeat, basically, because they've lost in southern Lebanon. They can't go forward. They lost, again, 62 tanks in less than 2 months. They can't sustain that. Their army is severely damaged. They've got a lot of casualties, which they're not admitting to. So they need to go and basically re-equip themselves for a while. They may try and come back and do it again, but Hezbollah's proved that they are very strong, and the root of that strength is they have a very strong connection with the masses in Lebanon itself, which can't be destroyed by violence, which is what the Israeli forces have tried to do, is what the US has tried to do. Well, I mean, if there's a ceasefire and then Trump comes back in and Netanyahu tries to restart things, to answer the comments that have been made there, how is it going to achieve anything for them? I mean, to imagine that Hezbollah doesn't know the game. I mean, they have shown that they have understood the game exactly that the US imperialists are playing. So we'll see how it goes. And we'll see what happens with the Gaza situation as well. Hello to Rista Kostadinov and to Abtin. T.G. Wilson says, fun fact, Obama's grandfather, Hussein Onyango Obama, was tortured by British brigadier and aide-de-camp to Queen Elizabeth II, Frank Kitson's terrorists in Kenya. Well, Obama's grandfather is much more heroic than the grandson, as it turns out. Okay, so Kion asked another question. Trying to arrive at a reasoned conclusion as to why groups such as the RCP should be avoided. Groups such as the RCP should be avoided because they essentially lead people nowhere. I mean, go and read if you don't believe me, go and read their analysis of the situation in West Asia, or go and read their analysis of the situation in Ukraine. What you will find is that they come to absolutely non-Marxist conclusions, dressed up in ultra-left language. Again, go read their analysis, and then if you want to question more, send me an email on it. I'll happily correspond with you over that. Zelensky and Netanyahu could be next-door neighbors in Miami. Very true. Abtin says, tuning in from a dental clinic in the countryside of southern Sweden. Good to have you with us. Rista Kostadinov says, I think in a few years, if Netanyahu is not cooed by his fundraisers, he will become Ian Smith, except there won't be another Israel to help with arming. Book Precision says, notice how the suicide bomb has stopped. What happened to the jihadists who used to massacre civilians in the West? Fizzled away. Well, stopped for now. I mean, we could go into speculative territory about what that was all about, but as I have said before, let's stick to what can be established here. And what can be established is the connections with the intelligence services that let's just use one very well-known example where this link is very well established. The link to the intelligence services of somebody like the Manchester bomber. There's a guy whose family was linked with the British intelligence services for years and years. And then suddenly he decides he's going to go and blow up an Ariana Grande concert. Why was he able to do that? Why is it that the public inquiry into the Manchester bombing did hear evidence from the security services, but this was all done in secret? Why was this man, who'd been on a terrorist watch list apparently prior to being allowed to travel to Libya, given a ride back from Libya by a British Royal Naval vessel? All of these are questions which the government hasn't answered, but these are all questions which have been brought up even in the bourgeois press. So quite what is going on there? Interesting questions. Hello to Jacob the Squirrel, who's with us. Bruce Albert says, dropping in here for rehab after hearing Alexander Mercouris of the Duran fawning over the noble Russian Tsar, family origins of the Russian PM. Yeah, I saw that. I mean, like, to answer the point about why quite a number of people who were related to the Russian aristocracy stayed on, well, there's always, with the Bolsheviks, there's always a few defectors from the former ruling circles who stay on and become servants of the new proletarian state. That will happen when the revolution breaks out here as well. So it's not a surprise. I mean, the presentation of the Russian aristocracy as noble, though, is a complete laugh, given that this layer basically led Russia into a ditch and made it into an indebted servant of British and French imperialism. So not a lot of nobility there, is there, unless you're overly impressed by baubles and jewellery. Yes, there's a lot of disgruntled reactionaries out there at the moment who have become enamored of multipolarity, but there you go. So, moving on through the comments. Yeah, I don't think it was the Russian PM Mercouris was referring to. I think he was referring to Narishkin, the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Services, the SVR. So, Bruce Albert says, Benez Czechoslovak government archives support the Soviet claims on Tukhachevsky, by the way. Yeah, Tukhachevsky was pro-German. Like, this guy had basically become like a pro-German fascist stooge. And like, we had like fascist, like bizarre fascist beliefs. So the purge of the senior military commanders wiped out like a pro-German, pro-fascist cell that Tukhachevsky was at the center of. And the locking up of like and the execution of the traitors, including people like Bukharin, and the rounding up of like the Trotskyite underground represented the squashing of a real threat that was in place there. it's a it's that's something which can be established by simply reading materials that were even present at the time. So this is only in doubt if you only ever read Trotsky and like other pro-Western sources. T.G. Wilson says, Alexander Mercouris once mentioned in a stream a meeting between British and US ruling class about sharing, handing over the empire, late 19th century. Anyone know about this? This isn't too controversial in actual fact, and it's not. It was. We're going to talk about this with Kit when he comes on. I mean, just look at the poem "The White Man's Burden" by that old reactionary Kipling. The British ruling class had turned very parasitic. British imperialism had turned very parasitic by the later period of the 19th century. They were already focusing on like export of capital over commodities. They were, as an industrial power, they were declining bit by bit in relation to the Germans and in relation to the United States. The whole point of Kipling's poem, White Man's Burden, is trying to make an appeal to the US to essentially take over the dirty business of securing the British Empire. Now, what the US ultimately took on was the dirty business of securing all of what had been the old European colonial empires. Took on the responsibility of safeguarding those, whilst at the same time, of course, stealing away much of the markets and the resources that had previously been monopolized by the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish to a degree as well. I mean, let's look at the way they took over Cuba and the Philippines and places like that from the Spanish and the Spanish-American War. So the wish of the British to hand over a lot of the responsibilities to the more dynamic and vital United States was there. It was a real thing. I don't know whether this was decided in one meeting or a series of meetings or whether this went on for a long period of time. I doubt that there was one big meeting where the whole thing was planned out, but there were those in the British ruling class who basically what they wanted to do was to secure their position as, to use the words of Harold Macmillan, to be as the Greeks were to the Romans. That's the aim that they had for themselves, and what they had for themselves was the idea that they were going to be the new force in the world. That the US was going to be the new force in the world, and therefore what was going to be done was the US would do the enforcement and the British would do the clipping of the coupons and handle the cultural side of things. And their long-term aim was to essentially maybe, I mean, this is my speculation, given the obsession that the British bourgeoisie has with the Roman Empire, be as the Greeks were to the Romans basically means take over the culture on a cultural and educational level, the American Empire, the way that like Greek culture came to define the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. And bear in mind, Western Roman Empire collapsed. The Eastern Empire continued in the form of the Byzantines for another almost 1,000 years after the end of the West, like over 900 years before the final fall of Constantinople to what became the Ottoman Turk Empire. So this idea that the British have been kicking around, it has some historic inspiration. Ultimately, though, it's a deluded one because the US ruling class has very much has their own interests. They were prepared to guarantee the positions of the British and the French for a while, and to a lesser extent, like the Germans, the Italians, and prop them up as powers during the Cold War. They are not prepared, though, to essentially have them operate independently. They, as Stalin correctly said, they get put on rations. but the British keep trying to exercise this influence over the US, and we'll talk more about that later on. Right. So, moving on then. Bruce says Czech KS has been strong locally in Kadaň, Moza, Teplice counties. You mean Czech communists? Interesting. I'll need to do more reading up on them. Hello to Robert Zvoranic, who joins us. Hello to the Pan American joining us from South Texas. And Pan American asks, what's your opinion on Trump's threat of 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada? Interesting. I mean, it's an opening gambit from Trump. I mean, with Trump's threats, you should always bear in mind that what he's essentially doing is preparing the ground for some kind of bargain. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. So we have our friend and collaborator Kit Clarenberg who's joined us, so we're going to bring him in now. Hello to Kit, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, good.
Pretty good, man. Yeah, you join us you join us in dramatic times, as always.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I have a slight cold, but you know, my duty to documenting these interesting times is paramount, so I'm not going to let that get in the way of today's broadcast. Yeah, you had an idea for the overall theme of this program. Perhaps
yes.
key viewers in.
Yes, I was just talking about that before you came on, but I'll go into exposition because I think, well, I want to get your take on this, and I want to then sort of use it to frame our discussion. So, as I was just saying, because I started a little bit early to take some comments from the audience, the phrase "we will be as the Greeks were to the Romans," attributed to former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, was probably one of the smarter reactionaries to occupy that post-war, in that he did have an understanding of history, and most of the rest of the morons who followed him clearly did not. But being as the Greeks were to the Romans isn't just simply a matter of submission, given that, as many will know, Greek culture came to not only inform the way that the Roman Empire viewed itself, or whether the way that the ruling circles of Rome viewed it themselves. Greek culture came to define what became the Eastern Roman Empire, which of course was strong in the area you're sitting now, Kit, obviously, and leaves its legacy around the former Yugoslavia. And the Byzantine Empire, as the Eastern Roman Empire became, is often described by many schools of history as being a rebirth of the old Greek Empire. So, and this lasted for almost 1,000 years beyond the end of the Western Roman Empire. So we should bear in mind that the British ruling class, from everybody from Macmillan to old custard sack Boris, are obsessed with Rome. Absolutely obsessed with it. Many Western ruling classes are, including the Americans themselves. But the British, there is a particular relevance to this obsession, because Macmillan's phrase isn't just a matter of accepting a subordinate place. It's a matter of seeing things in that way, that the British could go on to influence the Americans in the same way, and that they could define American cultural and elite education and define the American political system, so that the British Empire, having declined into parasitism a long time ago, could have a new lease of life in the form of the US. And that, I think, is the plan of a certain section of the British ruling class. And it's an idea that they've been pursuing relentlessly. You'd argue about the starting point. You could say the starting point was the 1890s. You could say that this intensifies after World War II. And it continues to intensify amongst groups of like Atlanticist reactionaries to this day, including people you have, of course, reported on extensively: Chris Donnelly, Gwytheon Prince, various others. So that, in my view, is the framing that it would be useful to use when discussing British plans for places like Ukraine. But let's start off with getting your view on that as a frame of discussion.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that, Harold Macmillan's purported phrase, I mean, of course, rather unhappily for Macmillan, the Greeks were ultimately slaves under the Romans, but as you allude to, but I mean, I think that yes, that it very tidily encapsulates a perspective which, as you say, has been prominent, if not predominant, within British elite thinking for a very long time, since the late 1800s. But I think yes, it became it intensified as a mission, as an objective, as a strategy during World War II. And I've very few people have reported on this, and it appears in very few history books, but there are some very interesting Foreign Office memos from this time, one of which forecasts rather forlornly that yes, post-war we will be expected to take up our place as a junior partner in an American global aegis. But it is also discussed when these officials are attempting to rationalize why this isn't the end of the world. I think they openly use the phrase, we can steer the grand US in directions that may serve our interests. And I think that as much as Macmillan's phrase has been the guiding precept in British both foreign and domestic policy ever since, really. And I think I mean we may in years to come consider the Ukraine debacle the ne plus ultra of this impulse among the British, and I think that yes, that we are that as we'll get into in more detail. But one of the things that really jumped out to me from past leaks that I've reported on is use of the phrase by senior British military intelligence apparatchiks who are prosecuting the Ukraine proxy war and are pushing for ever greater escalation, is they talk about US hesitancy and US reluctance. Now, number one, I mean, I do think that that speaks to the Doctor Strangelove-esque levels of belligerence that Britain is in which Britain is willing to engage, except it always has to be other people actually doing it for them. So I think that it's interesting on that level. But B is because I mean already US support for Ukraine has been to insanely dangerous levels, which have crossed multiple openly stated Russian red lines and are risking nuclear war every step of the way. But also, I think that confusion or bewilderment at the fact that the US aren't all in boots on the ground, let's smash the Ruskies, like that they're not taking that view. It's reflective of the fact that the British elite, as far as I can tell, they do genuinely seem to believe that they are safeguarding, defending Western civilization and values like freedom and democracy from barbarians at the gate, like the mad mullahs of Iran and the KGB and the sneaky Chinese. It's like I think that they genuinely really believe this, that they are on this perhaps God-sent mission to ensure that they rule the world due to their superiority. But not only that, they can't wrap their heads around the fact that the US always, despite the rhetoric, sees conflicts in terms of their bottom line. Okay, so the US actually, and this has rather been forgotten, or not even acknowledged at the time. There are many elements of the American kind of imperial brain trust who, pretty much since the start of this, have been saying we need to be careful about what we're sending, not only because of red lines, but because we don't have very much. We don't have the stockpiles to keep this going very long. It will result in disruption to global trade. It will produce inflation. And other economic issues, which are not going to be good news for us. So we can't have this go on forever. And that, I mean, this is there have been open statements by US officials and publicly available reports published by RAND, the Pentagon think tank, as we've discussed, at some length in the past, that have been saying we can't keep this going. Just from a practical point of view, and I mean, at a base level, they want and need enough people left alive in Ukraine for a post-war population to work for subsistence wages for US corporations. This is exactly what's happened in the Balkans, like in the wake of the grinding wars of the 1990s. And it's exactly why those wars were those proxy wars were waged in the 90s, and why they were ended by the US. It's like, well, we've had enough of this. Now it's time to move in and line our pockets. In many cases, personally, you have US officials who were involved in the bombing of Yugoslavia, who profited to the tune of millions from privatization in Kosovo that they imposed themselves. So, I mean, that's the American perspective. But the British perspective is, well, this war with Russia, it needs to be this proxy war via Ukraine with Russia needs to be this grand civilizational battle where the forces of the Asiatic hordes are finally beaten back, and Anglo-American supremacy is assured for centuries to come. But that's not the US perspective at all.
Yes, it's a perspective probably shared by some of the more outlandish think tank types in the United States. But there is a very much I would say a now threefold division in US circles, which is that some of them are obsessed with the idea that they can still get something out of this Ukraine war, though that's a diminishing number of people who believe that these days. Others are concerned with the position in West Asia, which is why it seems that the US has basically just told Netanyahu to wrap up the Lebanon war for now, because that's going quite badly wrong. So they'll tell him to wrap it up, pin the whole thing on him, and try and do something else. Then there's another school of thought linked to the latter, which is that the whole game is about China, and that's the area where they are looking to expand aggression there, using Taiwan, using the Philippines and other areas. And then I would add on top of that, there is another overarching element, which is concern over domination of what they regard as their hemisphere, which is Central America, the Caribbean, South America. There's very much a drive, I think, that Trump certainly represents some of this, that they want to establish full control over places like Venezuela, places like, obviously, Cuba, Nicaragua, Brazil. Now, the British line, as you correctly point out, has a certain influence, but nothing like the influence that would be enough to change those calculations entirely, which is why the British work so hard to try and influence every political force out there inside the United States. Like, there's an illusion that they prefer the Democrats. Like, they work just as hard in the Republican side, as we'll go on to see when we come to discuss a certain Mr. Gorka, or Agent Gorka, as perhaps we should refer to him. But let's get into it then, because we've got a lot to hit on today. So, going back to the discussion of last week, Kit, and the unleashing of what turns out to be a rather ineffectual attack by using ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. This goes back not only to reporting you've done recently, but your longer term reporting on the British role in the war. I'll just call up the story from the Grey Zone you did a while ago now, regarding the war itself. So this is from this is from your more recent one, but this was reporting you were doing a while back, which is the British plan with regard to the Ukraine war. Now, I remember having you on to discuss the plans of a certain Chris Donnelly and others who were linked to, of course, our mutual acquaintance Paul Mason, who had a big role in like amping up the Ukraine war. Now, can you talk about this and like how does this all link into what we've just been talking about here? Like the British plan for Ukraine, which seems to have been based upon like sabotage and terrorism operations, bizarre ideas about commando raids that seem to be based on an understanding of World War II that comes from like 1980s British comics rather than like a study of history. Which is it's literally like that level of shallowness is astonishing from people who regard themselves as so educated. But so this idea clearly is to just, from my read on it, it's to keep the Ukrainians fighting at all costs, no matter what, whether that's like full on like brutal encounters with the Russians in the trenches, or whether it's terrorism operations. But why don't you take this with like regard to your reporting on this?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, as you say, this is something that we at the Grey Zone have been reporting on for a very long time at this stage. But it's like, you know, it's important to bear in mind all of the biggest escalatory acts that Ukraine has carried out against Russia, or allegedly carried out against Russia, have been British proposals. So attacking Kerch Bridge. This was cooked up by the aforementioned Chris Donnelly and his kind of shadowy cabal of ex-NATO MI6 people who were prosecuting running Britain's involvement in the proxy war. They are just pushing for relentless escalation, irrespective of the consequences, both for Russians but Ukrainians themselves, in the form of counterattack. Now you mentioned that we discussed last week when it was not long after Ukraine had been greenlit the ability to conduct long-range strikes in Russia, which Britain have been calling for a very long time. Both Starmer and his predecessor Sunak were pushing for this, and the US wouldn't sign off on it, so it couldn't happen. And then it was announced with much fanfare that the outgoing Biden administration had finally given Ukraine permission to do this. They carried out a strike, which most of what they sent got shot down. And I think that they hit a mayonnaise factory or some other like kind of irrelevant site. And then Russia responded by sending a ballistic missile to strike Ukraine, which had never been used in Europe before. And Medvedev said, well, if you want escalation, you've got it. And next time it could be carrying nukes, and we can strike anywhere without you stopping this. The ballistic missiles, the ballistic and hypersonic missiles that Russia and China and Iran have, can barely be detected by Western systems, let alone shot down. So that was a very clear kind of counter gauntlet that got thrown down. And since then, nothing's really happened. There have been no major Ukrainian strikes inside Russia. And as I suggested at the time, while on paper it is a huge escalation, when reality kicks in, everyone backs off, and this has happened many, many, many times. I think last week we got into the example of how Grant Shapps had announced that he was thinking of sending British soldiers formally to Ukraine and deploying the Royal Navy to the Sea of Azov. And then Medvedev said, well, that makes your forces legitimate targets. And then this mad announcement was rescinded. So there's also a point that we'll get into, I'm sure, which is the fact that Western stockpiles of everything are basically nil at this point, and it was openly reported by the Times that one of the reasons that Starmer hasn't been sending Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine is they've got so few left. British military chiefs don't want to send any more. But they've probably got a few dozen themselves. So yes, but like all of this escalation is coming from the UK. Now, if you could just load up this Pravda article, possibly.
Yep, certainly.
Yeah, just before we get into Agent Gorka, this is Ukrainska Pravda. It's a independent and by no means anti-government Ukrainian media outlet, which does do some really good reporting actually amidst the amidst the propaganda. Now, this is a very, very long, I think it's about 7,000 words, a very long post-mortem on a operation that's been largely forgotten now. Excuse me, I'm hiccuping.
I'll give you a shock to get rid of the hiccups. Vote Labour.
Sorry.
There you go. That'll shock you.
No, thank you. It has actually cured it. So
yes,
basically, last year, like in kind of October 2023, Ukraine started sending wave after wave after wave of Marines to capture a beachhead in this small village in occupied Kherson called Krinky. Now, it got very little media coverage at the time, apart from reporting on what a desperate situation it was, because Ukrainian Marines were being sent in via boat under relentless Russian fire to get to this tiny beachhead in this tiny village. And they didn't have sufficient equipment. Most people were getting killed before they got there. And then yet they just carried on sending wave after wave after wave of people into this. It got rather forgotten and seems to have petered out in July this year without much in the way of fanfare or formal announcement that what had come to a close. And the excellent History Legends, which is a military analysis channel, did track this and what an utter disaster it was at every stage. Now, Ukrainska Pravda have now published this post-mortem on how the Krinky operation was known pretty much from the word go to be a total disaster, to be unwinnable, to be a lost cause. And then yet Ukrainian military chiefs just kept carrying on and on and on, sending these under-equipped people on certain suicide missions to capture this strategically irrelevant village. The details of this are very, very interesting and worthy of consideration, just in terms of the insanity of Ukraine's war strategy and planning. However, the most interesting parts of this delved into how Krinky was a British operation. It was proposed by the British. The British then trained scores of Ukrainian Marines in Britain to carry out this operation. They supplied a lot of the equipment for it. And so, Krinky will probably go down in history as one of the greatest military disasters in modern history. Now, something that really jumped out to me is this quote from a Marine who was involved in the situation, in the operation, and he said, as bad as it was, we could have opened a second front and changed the course of the war, as was the case with the Normandy landings. And this is apparently several Marines interviewed by Ukrainska Pravda made the same point. Now, this is exactly the kind of boy's own 1980s comic book fantasy to which you alluded, Alex.
Yes.
And I think that absolutely the British military and intelligence establishment have all sorts of insane, highly romantic and bogus ideas about World War II, which conveniently completely ignore the Soviet Union's role in this, which is 90% of the fighting in Europe was done by the Soviet Union. But then they view things like D-Day, which obviously looms large in American conceptions of World War II as well, as Britain's finest hour. And it's like, well, I mean, you couldn't have done it if the Soviets hadn't completely destroyed the Nazi army beforehand. And so it's just and then as we've discussed, the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, this heavily informs how Britain has approached this war. They want to create secret partisan armies in the manner of Gladio. People men and women who blend in amongst the local population and carry out assassinations and sabotage and terror attacks. And that is based on a very, again, romantic view of Special Operations Executive, that it was somehow fundamental to Britain winning the war, when in reality, it didn't achieve very much.
This has been
a walk on. Sorry.
Yeah, this has been written about many times. In fact, even in like British histories, like the SOE is described as basically being run by a collection of wild eccentrics. Some of whom were associated with the likes of Aleister Crowley, the old Satanist guy, and who ran like a lot of operations, a lot of which were disasters, but which got basically romanticized. And one thing I would just throw into the mix: there's been an awful lot of programs, quite high cost programs, done by the BBC recently about special operations and commando units and sabotage operations in World War II. So there was the whole very expensive drama about the foundations of the SAS and a romanticization of Colonel David Sterling, a man we're all familiar with, I'm sure. Then there's this new one, the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which basically covers SOE. So again, there's nothing happens in the British system by coincidence. There's a reason why they're running all these programs that cost a lot of money to make right now. It's because this is what they have in mind for British operations in the future, and they want to hammer this point home about the glories of the past, or the imagined glories of the past, into the mind of the domestic population. Never mind the fact that the reason why D-Day happened when it did was because they were absolutely sure that if they didn't do it, then the Red Army would roll all the way to the Atlantic coast. And that would be real trouble for the British and the Americans. So this is about really preserving capitalism in Western Europe. That's what D-Day was really all about.
Yeah, and I might add as well, so in recent years we've had a lot of books about SOE, a lot of TV shows about SOE, films about SOE, and also I recently played a video game called Sniper Elite 5, which is all about SOE, and they win the war in the game. It's like, this is not an accident that this stuff is being venerated, and I think that it has this mythological significance in the British imagination, which is it completely omits the Soviet Union's role, not only in terms of that actually being what won the war, but also this is who they're up against now. And like we discussed, there have been several examples of operations during the Ukrainian proxy war, where a significant part of the planning was that the Russians would just run away. And Krinky, which I mentioned, is no exception. So the BBC in December reported on the hell of the Krinky operation, and it stated, and it has this quote in it, and I'll read it verbatim. We thought after we made it to Krinky, the enemy would flee, and then we could calmly transport everything we needed, but it didn't turn out that way. shock horror. like it just you know what I mean? It was just literally they thought I'm going to be writing something about this, and I'll link to that BBC piece that they literally thought that when they landed, the Russians would just leave them alone, and then they could effectively just set up a beachhead there unmolested, and as Ukraine's Pravda says, push on to Crimea. And like this is what, and then, but actually they were under, relentless attack from flamethrowers, artillery, rockets, bullets. They couldn't even collect the bodies of the dead. It was just like it just sounds like a complete and utter nightmare. And this is the inevitable masterminds of this were the British. And it's just like, and I think, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is such a ludicrous thing, because if your battle plan is dependent upon the enemy running away, then, well, what are you basing that on? Really and truly, because for all that, the British military in post World War II had some ludicrous figures within it and had some ludicrous commanders, they did fundamentally know at one level that they didn't really stand much of a chance in a direct fight with the Red Army, which is why they never really instigated one. They relied on other methods to get their way. This seems bizarre because it seems to be based, as we talked about last week, on an understanding of the Russian military that is at least 30 years out of date. They don't seem to have taken into account, again, things that are publicly available information, such as multiple reorganizations of the Russian military by the Putin-led governments, some of which worked, some of which did not. And also the mood within Russia itself, the relative strength now of the Russian state vis-a-vis 20 years ago when Putin first got in, and modern examples of Russia fighting. So, for instance, the same people predicted that Russia would fall apart when it sent its forces into Syria 10 years ago now, almost 10 years ago. Didn't happen. So I really struggle to understand how these people can be so far gone on their own fumes, basically, smelling their own farts to the point where they get completely high, to the point where they can no longer even just analyze basic things. So to believe that the Russians would run away, again, based on what? It's bizarre.
Yeah, well, as we discussed last week, the Red Army gained a reputation in World War II for just fighting to the last man consistently, and there is a record of when the Nazis invaded under Barbarossa, they executed the Soviet border guards, and the Nazi commander who gave the order to execute them recorded in his diary subsequently that it was all very unsettling and upsetting for us, because when we were lining these people up to shoot them, they were laughing and joking and mocking us, and we could tell that they had absolutely no fear of death, and they knew their deaths would be avenged. Right, so the Nazis who were executing them in cold blood were frightened of them, and it's but yeah, they're going to run away now.
Yeah,
again, it's madness. It's
with no air cover either. You have no ability to suppress the Russian artillery. You have no let's use the D-Day example. The Americans and the British assembled a massive armada to do a naval bombardment of the German positions on the shore, which, by the way, was pretty ineffectual in terms of actually suppressing. Yeah. Anyway, they didn't even have that. So this is absolute, to go into a theoretical point for the moment. This is what happens at the end of after years of decay in the imperialist system. You end up with people running the system who haven't even got an understanding of their own past. They have a Marvel movie understanding of their own past,
yes,
and a comic understanding of their own past, and so they genuinely believe that if we just do a battle reenactment of D-Day, then the Russians will just run away. It's insane.
Yeah, and it's. I think that this is the thing: is there is this insanity right? In particularly in the corridors of British power, and American power too, but I think to a lesser extent. Particularly now you have people like Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence. I mean, just as a brief tangent, like there is a hilarious Telegraph article in which all of these awful people about whom I've been writing for years, including Richard Dearlove, who called me an unpleasant little journalist on live TV for covering his leaked emails, which I consider to be a lifetime achievement award, Richard, if you are listening. But also Hamish de Bretton Gordon, who was heavily involved in the staging of chemical weapons attacks in Syria in order to get the US to invade Syria, and this was and doing this for MI6, cooking up fake evidence, staging attacks, so the Obama administration would intervene. And then they're all complaining about Tulsi getting the nomination. Well, their fear is our game, I think, actually. But yeah, that, like, I mean, if you go down to this FT article that I included, Alex, please. Yeah, that basically Britain has launched a national security review, and this is a very sober and on the money analysis from the FT with very little in the way of illusions, and it basically states that the review, as with prior reviews, is an attempt to reconcile grandiose ambitions with economic austerity, and it goes on to state that Britain has a Potemkinville village military retaining the emblems of a pocket superpower, but without the necessary hard capabilities. And it just goes on. It goes on, and it states that Britain's military chiefs mutter privately that their forces would struggle to fight a European war lasting more than a few weeks. So, as worrying and disturbing as the existence and influence of people like Chris Donnelly and his cabal of lunatics, or people like Richard Dearlove or Hamish de Bretton Gordon, the fact of the matter is that the actual kind of people at the very, very top of the military, while they are very fond of sky-high boys' own fantasy stuff when it's other countries doing it for them, like Ukraine, when actually it comes to their own forces, they realize that they are basically defenseless and would be crushed comprehensively by Russia if they were foolish enough to enter a hot war scenario, which is why I think the British and the French suggesting that they could send soldiers to Ukraine will, in the manner of Ukraine allowing to strike deep inside Russia, probably fade in about a week or so. Right, because France has already mooted doing this. They did so earlier this year, and then Macron stated that he wanted to create a quote-unquote dilemma for the Russians by placing 30,000 French soldiers in Odessa to prevent them pushing into there. And then a senior Russian official was asked by a French journalist, well, what would you do if France did this? And the Russian official responded, well, we'll just kill them.
Why would they do anything else?
Yeah.
What do they think What do these people think they are? They think they're the army of God or something. They're like the immortal Western Crusaders will turn up, and the Russians will think, oh well, we can't possibly fire on them. That would be unsporting. And the other point is, like, how are they going to get 30,000 men into Odessa? How are they ever going to do that? Like, how are the British going to get their 20,000 tops, like fighting men into Ukraine? What do they think the Russians are just going to let them maneuver this large amount of men and equipment across the western border? This doesn't make any sense. I mean, the only way this makes sense is if it is, I think, an attempt by London and Paris to destabilize, to knock the Russians off course by bluffing them, basically. By making it look as if they're going to do something, in order to, well, depending upon which point of view you want to take, in order to either like force the Russians into a disadvantageous peace negotiation, or like give the Ukrainians the hope that the Crusaders are coming. Just keep on going, lads. They're coming, we swear.
Yeah.
And to keep the war going, or perhaps some combination of the two. Because it can't be a serious proposition, can it?
No, I mean, I completely agree. And this goes back to, as we discussed, Project Alchemy, which, I mean, I think they clearly thought so just as a refresher, if for whatever reason you didn't catch last week's episode, that this secret spy military cell, it was created by the British Ministry of Defence, which has been prosecuting the proxy war and coming up with all sorts of completely insane plots for the Ukrainians to carry out and get killed in the process. It's called Project Alchemy. They clearly thought the military apparatchiks who came up with this name clearly thought it sounded mysterious and a bit sexy. And of course, alchemy was the completely junk science of turning base metals into gold. So it's probably actually quite an inadvertently and unintentionally accurate title for these lunatics. But yeah, I just that over and over again in these leaked documents that we at the Grey Zone have reported on, they state we need to keep Ukraine fighting. We need to keep Ukraine fighting, and they explicitly state that they need to manipulate the Ukrainians via information operations to make this seem winnable from their perspective. So they keep going. And yes, dangling the possible prospect of, we're going to come, like one of these days, lads, we're going to arrive and we're going to come to the rescue. Just keep it up while we're getting ready. Like that could be a means of attempting to manipulate them. But I mean, I came across a hilarious, although very depressing, in the manner of these things, article in The Economist recently, which was
I'll pull that up now.
Yeah. Which is like that. It is that there is a passage which begins with Ukraine's problems, and this is about the issues that Ukraine is having on the front line, where Russia is making big arrow advances every day without any resistance. There is a passage which begins, Ukraine's problems are worsening mainly because of manpower issues. The army is long out of willing recruits. Its mobilization campaign is falling short, recruiting barely 2/3 of its target. A senior Ukrainian official says he is worried the situation may become irretrievable by the spring. An even bigger problem is the quality of the new recruits. A battalion commander told The Economist that the people being sent to him from army headquarters were now too old or unmotivated to be useful. All but a handful are over the age of 45. I'm being sent guys 50 plus with doctor's notes telling me they're too ill to serve. At times, it feels like I'm managing a daycare center rather than a combat unit. And then the next paragraph talks about how one of the new recruits is Grigory, a 51-year-old former laborer, gold-toothed and ruddy-faced. He squints through heavy prescription glasses, and his ill-fitting body armor flaps unfastened over his short, stocky frame. He admits he was as surprised as anyone when he was enlisted. He didn't expect the officers to mobilize someone who was half blind. He finds it difficult to walk with flak jackets, but has got used to handling firearms. Anyone can shoot, he says. It's hitting the target I'm not so good at. And it's just like, I mean, it's you couldn't write if this was in a really bleak farcical comedy about the pointlessness and futility of war. You couldn't write this. It would seem unrealistic and silly, actually. And it's like this is, there is a lot of debate about broadening and a lot of pressure on Ukraine from abroad to massively ramp up its mobilization to include any Ukrainian male over the age of 16.
That's what the FT basically called for that last week when they published a graphic. Again, I think depending upon some very dodgy figures from the Ukrainian Rada, saying that there was at least like another, what, 1.5 to 2 million men who could be mobilized, like between the ages of like 16 and 64. So that, I mean, that it's not, these stories don't appear by accident in the Financial Times. That's like a Bible of the British ruling class. So that's clearly what they're thinking about. And I think that the recent missile strikes, I mean, I think that what will happen with these missile strikes is that they'll burn through all their attackers and all their storm shadows and scalps, and then Cuck Schultz will just agree to send them to Taurus anyway, or Friedrich Merz will end up doing it. They'll fire all these off into Russia, hit a few things. The Russians will just keep hammering Ukraine, and it won't change the course of the war on the battlefield one iota. And meanwhile, all of these poor bastard Ukrainians will be herded to the front by apparently like the fascist guys standing behind them, literally with guns in their backs, telling them fight and die there or we'll kill you anyway, just to hold up the Russian advance. That's where we've got to.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, there's another point to make here as well, which is that like I mean, if you look at polls, and I have found some interesting data that was recently published in Russia, and you also look at now mainstream media reporting on how there's been a consumer spending boom in Russia. This is actually, from an economic standpoint, at least for the time being, going very well for the Russians. It's also militarily going well for the Russians, because, I mean, Sun Tzu said the highest form of warfare is to disarm your opponent without fighting. Now, there was a report from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, in January 22, which is to say before the proxy war started, which basically made the point that Western weapons deliveries to Ukraine were pointless because the Russians would just destroy it all. Because they focus heavily on artillery rather than infantry fighting and and other warfare strategies. So it was known that sending Ukraine all of these weapons was going to be A, pointless, and B, like actually probably very counterproductive. And then you fast forward to today, and Zelensky, who with some bombast stated in October 2022 he destroyed the professional Russian army personally, and it was now ready to destroy the amateur one. We're pretty far from there to like two and a bit years on, and it's like the Russians can keep this going for presently for a very long time. They have brought NATO to its effective knees by sapping all of their vehicles and all of their ammunition stockpiles built up over years, and they're still using a tiny fraction of their forces. And meanwhile, they are recruiting, per the mainstream media, 1,000 people a day to the military. So it's like, and I think that there are so many reports now in the mainstream media that, well, in this field, the West is not on a par with Russia, is nowhere versus Russia, or isn't even investing and equipping itself with this technology or this weaponry. So it's like electronic warfare, where there are multiple reports in the mainstream about how Russian electronic warfare has completely made redundant the once much vaunted HIMARS and other missile systems, and how yes, the Russians have also relentlessly innovated in the fields of like drone warfare and all these other fields, which Western militaries aren't even being trained in any serious way. So it's like, again, when the prospect of the dilapidated, disarmed, outproduced, outmanned, and outgunned Western militaries now entering into a conflict with Russia, when Russia is spending a comparatively tiny proportion of its GDP on keeping this going, and is growing economically quicker than any other country in Europe. Actually, they are fine with keeping this going as long as it takes from their perspective. And, we hear that phrase over and over and over again. The special military operation will continue until its objectives are completed. A lot of any talk of a ceasefire is just going to be laughed at by the Russians. Peace talks, if they are initiated, the Russians will make maximalist demands and will have zero reason to back down. And again, I think that the slightly more sensible and sober people within British and American military and intelligence circles know this, because it's writ very large. It's writ very large.
I pulled up the other link you sent over, which is, of course, that some of them clearly are considering ditching Zelensky and bringing in Zaluzny as a sort of shuffling of the deck here. In my view, like, this would be done with regards to with an eye on potential negotiations. Not on actually, trying to win the war, because they can't do that. So the idea being that Zaluzny is big in with the Banderists anyway, so he can bring along the rabid fascistic types to accept some kind of compromise. Problem with that logic is that as you said, the Russians have no motivation to actually make concessions here, and also they have no reason now really to respect the government in Kiev as anything other than just a comprador regime for the US and the British. So in any case, like, the only real discussion that would take place wouldn't be between Zelensky or Zaluzny with the Russians. It would be between representatives of the American government and the Russians. That would be the ultimate bargaining point.
Yes.
Whether those discussions are public or ever acknowledged or not is another question. But it's my view that this ends really with some kind of agreement between the US and the Russians as to the future of Ukraine, and that is what will end it. The British will find themselves basically frozen out, as will the French, as will the Germans, because it will be an American decision as to when to call time on this. But what's your view?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that for the reasons that we've discussed in the past, the Americans know that they can't keep this running very much longer, or if at all. There was a RAND report in July, which I only just caught wind of recently. I wrote about it for my website, kitklarenberg.com, shameless plug. The US is running out of ammunition, it's running out of missiles, and it can't replenish what's been lost at any speed or with any ease. And that RAND report basically stated that the US does not have a defense industrial base anymore. The US weapon commissioning consists of having Raytheon's phone number. We're not going to be able to build a serious military that can meet modern threats under present conditions. And it effectively called for the reindustrialization of the US, which is, of course, never going to happen. But it's the Americans don't want this going on much longer, and also can't sustain it very much longer. So I think it could end actually very abruptly, even without a formal press conference announcing this. Now, there are two historic examples which I frequently return to because I think they're highly apropos for different reasons. Number one, the Bosnian War in the 90s. This was a US proxy war with the US backing the Bosniaks and the Croats in Bosnia against the Bosnian Serbs in order to just completely destroy Yugoslavia. Now, this went on for 3 years, and at every stage, the Bosniaks were encouraged by the US to reject peace talks, not to make any concessions, not to negotiate, and just keep fighting, even though they were being killed in large numbers, because they were up against a far superior military force with greater resources. Now, when the US got bored of this, they brought the war to a close with a series of airstrikes on the Bosnian Serbs, and turned around to the Bosniaks and said, well, you're now going to have to accept whatever terms we dictate to you. And if you don't accept them, we're just going to abandon you and not give you any financial and military support, and you'll be at the mercy of the Bosnian Serbs. And so they had to accept a far worse peace deal than any of the proposals they'd rejected previously. Okay, like considerably worse terms they were forced to accept, and I think that is completely on the cards with Ukraine. Now, in the Bosnian Serbs were given more territory than Slobodan Milosevic thought was fair or humane. Under the terms of this US brokered peace. It was so I mean I can very much see the US imposing Ukraine handing over Odessa and Kharkiv. I think that is plausible, right? Because they want this done and over with, no further cause for conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and as I say, what remains of Ukraine's population can get hard at work for BlackRock. Okay, but another historical analogy to use is Afghanistan. Now, the pullout from Afghanistan, which has been largely forgotten now, but only occurred 3 and a bit years ago, that the scale of it came as a shock to everyone, including the Afghan government itself. And there is a very interesting report by the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, which of course got zero media pickup whatsoever. I've written about it, but by contrast, it stated that the Afghan government didn't believe the US when they said that they were leaving. They thought that they couldn't. They thought that there was no way, having invested all of this money and time and energy in the most important geopolitical bit of real estate in the world, that they would step away from it. And they created an entire state, including a military and police force and intelligence service and road sweepers. They were all built by US aid over 20 years, and there were many Western defense analysts who thought that this was only going to be a paper withdrawal and the US would stay. In June 2021, Ghani, the US puppet in Kabul, flew to DC, and there was also posed in smiling photo ops with Joe Biden, and there were statements by US spokespeople about how the US is committed to ensuring a democratic and free and stable Afghanistan, and the US and Afghanistan will remain key allies, blah 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 blah. And then 3 months later, Ghani's on a plane to the UAE, and he's never heard of again.
Yeah,
that level of rapidity could occur here at any time.
Well, yes. Once the various mafias that were contained within the Afghan government found out that the paymaster was leaving, then the whole thing just fell apart. It was like a building in which you take out the central foundation, and the whole thing just falls in on itself. The same would be true of Ukraine. If the US does pull back, even if it's unacknowledged in any way, then the Kiev regime falls to pieces. I saw reports from outside of Kiev, in Odessa, and a couple of other urban centers, in Lvov. Outside of those areas, the country's falling to pieces. Literally, it's like they're keeping an oasis of unreality in some of the urban centers, but everywhere else, the government's authority is faltering. Their writ just simply doesn't run in a lot of areas. There is, and I get unconfirmed reports of this from listeners to the program who have access to Ukrainian sources. There is an underground resistance in Ukraine. that consists of like various anti-government forces, including the Ukrainian communists, who are still actually carrying out sabotage operations on the NATO forces. So this won't take much to fall apart. This won't take much before Zelensky's on the tarmac in Gostomel air base with a case full of dollars running for a transport plane. So it's just a question of like how bad and how embarrassing the collapse will be in the end, not whether it happened. Everything that's being done now is designed to basically try to throw the Russians off their stride, I think. That's the limit of what they're trying to do. The Russians, though, know this. They are able to see the figures for the industrial capacities of Britain, France, the collapsing industrial capacity of Germany, the inability of the American weapons manufacturers to step up production because the system's too corrupt and parasitic and just soaks up the money for the shareholders rather than actually developing new lines of production. They know all this. And so they know very well that all they need to do is to keep on the course they are on now, and eventually the victory will come. Whether the US tries to salvage anything from the situation is another question, but the outcome really isn't in doubt, is it?
No, not at all. And it's like, I think as well that the another like calculation within Russian thinking is that the blowback from this is going to be absolutely huge as well. And I this is something I've reported on for the Grey Zone. It bears repeating. There was a Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. Every single year they publish a report on threats, usually heavily redacted, and they cover some of the work of the intelligence and security services. They're usually quite scathing, but the one way or another. But in this report at the start of 2023, it explicitly stated that there is a high risk of people returning from frontline combat in redacted country, i.e. Ukraine. It is likely they will have extremist views, have made extremist contacts, and will have access to weapons. There is a risk of that they could carry out violent acts, and at present there is no mechanism for dealing with them. And it's like, well, Zelensky himself has as good as threatened that Ukrainian refugees won't take kindly to Ukraine being abandoned. He said as much as in an interview with The Economist, well, they've behaved well so far, but that could change. And I think that another really core component of Russian thinking on this is that like there is going to be a major wave of far right violence, a mass, probably bombings and all sorts, like all over Europe, as for years to come after this. It's going to be in like total disarray, and that's going to be exacerbated by the economic impact of the sanctions which these countries themselves imposed. So I mean, that again, all the more reason to want to keep this going, and not really having any interest in ending this until or unless they can get what they want out of it. And the longer it's gone on, their objectives have broadened.
Well, let's conclude this section of the discussion by looking at, in a way of transitioning to the discussion about Britain's influence inside the United States, by transitioning to, of course, your recent article on Agent Gorka. A man who is a truly bizarre figure. He's a sort of classic, I would say, like con man to a degree. A guy who's got family links, as you outline, to like Hungarian fascist organizations going all the way back to World War II, whose family was linked to the pro-fascist coup attempt in 1956 in Hungary, who has been, as you point out, and you and Max Blumenthal point out in the piece, he's a former British Territorial Army reservist, clearly has links to British intelligence as well, but has been rebranding himself amongst like American right-wing circles as an ultra MAGA guy who goes over there with like a sort of very exaggerated British accent. Like nobody in Britain, even in the upper classes, actually speaks like that. But he has essentially been selling himself as Mr. America First, though he has all the same views as Keir Starmer when it comes to most issues, and all the same views as Tony Blinken. So why don't you take it away with like, who is Agent Gorka and like, what is his role?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's just he is a absolutely fascinating character, and actually, since Max and I wrote this all of 2 days ago, I've actually had a couple of people contact me who knew Gorka when he was part of the British defence establishment, which have been fascinating conversations to say the least. So basically, yes, Gorka was he grew up in London. His parents were hardcore Hungarian nationalists who were affiliated with this pro-Nazi, anti-communist group called Vitezi Rend. They collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. They were involved in the fascist coup attempt that you mentioned in 1956, which is just as a side point, usually cited widely as a brutal Soviet crackdown on the forces of democracy in Hungary. Make of that what you will. Sebastian Gorka's father was broken out of jail by this group, this fascist group, Vitezi Rend. He fled to the UK, and he worked for the British government, was involved in Britain's kind of anti-communist crusade during the Cold War. Sebastian Gorka, when he was at university, he was involved in the British Territorial Army, and it's very odd because there are multiple conflicting accounts of what he was doing during this time and who he was working for. There are suggestions he was part of a British military NATO cell, or that he was involved as an interrogator of Russian speakers from the Soviet Union. There was also claims that he was just working straight up for British intelligence during this time. Anyway, in 1999, he got this fellowship at NATO, and this is after he returned to Hungary, and this is at a time when Hungary was moving towards NATO membership, which was not without controversy. Not only in Moscow, but within Hungary itself, there was a lot of enmity, enduring enmity towards NATO at the time. Now, he thereafter. Gorka was a very prominent advocate for NATO, and was endorsing America's invocation of Article 5 to launch the war in Afghanistan, it seems maintained a very close relationship with the British Ministry of Defence at this time. One of the people who contacted me after I published this article said that they remembered him very well because he had this exaggerated British accent even then, in the 90s, which British people themselves thought was quite comical. The way that he spoke, and that yes, it was quite clear that he was very, very, very hawkish, rabid anti-communist, and an anti-Russian as a result, and was even then quite clearly had a deep-seated hatred of Muslims, and yes. So I mean, after this kind of bizarre background, on the front line of Hungary's getting gobbled up into the NATO fold, he then moves to the US and becomes this far-right media personality and very, very, very pro-Trump. Now, in 2018, these documents related to Integrity Initiative, which was a British intelligence black propaganda unit set up to publicize fake news about Russia leaked online, and it showed that Chris Donnelly, the aforementioned lunatic running Britain's proxy war contribution, he travelled to Washington DC to try and drum up stateside support for Integrity Initiative and therefore war with Russia. And the first item on his agenda when he arrived in DC was breakfast with Sebastian Gorka. Now, I might add as well that it is very clear that they have a that Gorka and Donnelly have this very long-running relationship, and given Gorka's British intelligence background, that would be unsurprising. And this, in 2005, Chris Donnelly wrote this book called Nations, Alliances and Security, and the blurb discusses how Donnelly was on the front line of NATO expansion and bringing former enemies into the Atlantic community. And the foreword was written by Sebastian Gorka, and it was also edited by Sebastian Gorka, which is it is quite odd that this alleged hardcore America First MAGA aficionado who quit Trump's government because he felt that there were anti-MAGA forces arrayed against him and the president, is meeting with the head of this Integrity Initiative network, which was a central player in Russiagate and helped get the dodgy Trump-Russia dossier circulated at the highest levels of the British government and disseminated its content, as well as, again, yes, lots of other damaging fake news about Russian meddling in Spain or in the Brexit referendum. But all of those bullshit stories we heard from 2016 onwards about Russian meddling in Europe, they were all concocted by this British intelligence outfit run by Chris Donnelly. And, you know, the same documents list Sebastian Gorka's wife, Catherine, who was then a senior advisor at the Department of Homeland Security, as a key contact. And then it's described how Integrity in the Initiative's networks overseas, which they call clusters, which are these secret cadres of politicians and academics and spooks and pundits and journalists who spread anti-Russian propaganda. The file states, cluster operatives engage only very discreetly with governments based entirely on trusted personal contacts and try to influence them gently. Now, now that Sebastian Gorka is back in the Trump administration as Trump's counter-terror chief, someone who is vigorously opposed to Trump's America First agenda and any US quote-unquote pullback from Europe more generally and Ukraine specifically, which is to say Chris Donnelly, now has a direct line to Sebastian Gorka and could attempt to try to influence Trump gently, as the documents say. I mean, I'm not sure what to make of this, but whether it's just British delusion, or whether this could potentially be something quite dangerous and substantive. But it's quite clear that, yes, Gorka and this complete lunatic who wants World War III with Russia because he thinks it will be this like grand hurrah in which the Anglo-Americans finally triumph over the Russians, has a direct line to the president.
Well, the thing about Gorka is like he's such an outlandish joke of a man that he has mainly got where he is by constantly saying how pro-MAGA he is, how much he is in favor of President Trump. He's like, the one thing that they've got right in the approach is that they've realized that the one thing you have to do is to swear public loyalty to Trump at all times and tell everybody how much of a genius he is, even if you're going to fundamentally subvert some of the things that he says he wants to achieve. which is, and the fact that Gorka has been given a promotion this time around to a much higher level appointment. One of the problems Gorka had in the first administration was that the US intelligence agencies wouldn't give him a security clearance. So he couldn't actually do his job, which is one of the reasons why he ultimately ducked out. So whether Trump's created this position for him, or whether it's a purely presidential appointment that doesn't require congressional oversight or approval, or I would imagine it requires a intelligence clearance for him to be given access to U.S. intelligence documents. I would think counterterrorism czar basically would require that. So whether he will get that clearance is another matter. Whether certain aspects of U.S. intelligence really want some MI6 clown running a key office is another matter. So he could, of course, be forced out. They could deny him clearance, but the thing about Gorka, I think that what his role would be to say to President Trump, and if you'll pardon the Gorka impression I'm about to do, Kit, Mr. President, you can't possibly back down to this Asiatic ruffian in the Kremlin, sir. You know, and Donald Trump will go, well, sure, yeah, of course, that's a great idea, Sebastian. Let's send them the Tomahawk or something like that. Maybe that's what Chris Donnelly is wanting.
Yeah. Well, it's just I think that would absolutely be the objective. And yes, as I've said in his briefing notes, Donnelly talks about how the US position must be challenged firmly and at once, and that long-standing relationship with Gorka could be leveraged to that in that manner. And I think that's one of the reasons that Trump is disliked by the US Intelligence Committee, which is to say that he is quite volatile and can make kind of abrupt unilateral decisions, which they then, at least in theory, have to carry out, is also potentially a blessing in terms of getting the US to take action. Now, I mentioned Gabbard being in the Director of National Intelligence role. Now, what a lot of people don't recall is that the Syrian dirty war, to all intents and purposes, came to an end at the start of 2018 because someone showed Trump a video of a teenager being beheaded by Noor al-Dinky, which is one of the CIA-backed extremist groups that were being used to destroy Syria. And then Trump said, right, well, that's us over then. Now, this is we're stopping this now, and this is after almost a decade of vast billions being pumped into Operation Timber Sycamore, it was called, to fund and train and arm the Syrian quote-unquote moderate rebels by the CIA and MI6. However, on the flip side, subsequent to this, Trump was compelled to carry out missile strikes on Syria because someone showed him footage of alleged victims of the Duma chemical attack in April 2018. Now, it is clear based on leaks and independent investigations that the Duma attack was staged by British intelligence operatives and assets on the ground, and this was specifically done to keep the war going. So, Trump's malleability is both a blessing and a curse. But markedly, Gabbard, of course, publicly criticized Trump's response and questioned whether Duma was an opposition fraud specifically intended to keep the conflict going. Now, again, the fact that people who have previously personally sought to bounce the US into belligerent action and effectively doing Britain's dirty work for it because it lacks the wealth or the muscle or the influence to do it themselves, is now in quite an influential position overseeing and coordinating now that these people are angry about who is coordinating the work of the intelligence agencies, in effect by occupying the DNI position, this could be quite promising in preventing Trump being influenced by the suggestions of people like Gorka. And I also think as well, and I don't want to big up Gabbard too much as this kind of great white hope, but I do think that she could, to an extent, rein in the worst excesses of people like lunatics like Marco Rubio and Tim Walz, at least to some extent on some issues. I do think overall that this is probably the most pro-Zionist administration in US history, and I think that things are probably going to the outlook for the Palestinians is incredibly bleak under this government. But there are small silver linings to be had. We will see what happens, but it would not surprise me if that actually very quickly the US moves away from Ukraine, whether that's formally or just kind of without being acknowledged. And ultimately, if the US is getting the hell out of Dodge, the French and the British have no choice but to either. Again, I mentioned Afghanistan. It's rather forgotten that there were several British officials who suggested that in the wake of the US withdrawal, that Britain could form a international coalition of its own to maintain the occupation and keep the Taliban out of Kabul. We see how long that lasted as an idea. Reasons for cautious optimism. And I do think that there's other causes for cautious optimism. One of them being, if you get the Georgia story up, possibly, please, mate.
Yep.
That basically we just had a very interesting failed coup in Georgia, where after the ruling Georgia Dream, much hated by the West and foreign agents in Georgia, of which there are a great many of them, won a landslide victory fair and square in the October elections. Now, Georgia Dream has nominated an individual called Mikhail Kavalashvili. I hope that I pronounced his name correctly. He's a quite popular and well-known former professional footballer.
He used to play for City about 25 years ago.
Yeah. So a bit of a local hero in Georgia. He is a member of the People's Power Party, which is part of the I believe they're part of the ruling coalition. Although he certainly has positive relations with Georgian Dream. He has been nominated to run for president in Georgia in December. He is someone who opposes Western meddling in Georgia. He was a key author of the very controversial foreign transparency law, which caused all of these protests in Georgia, and has also publicly criticized the US and Ukraine for pressuring Georgia to open a second front in the proxy war. Now, the current president of Georgia is this woman called Salome Zurabichvili, who wasn't even born in Georgia and spent most of her life as a French diplomat to Georgia, who then returned under US puppet Mikhail Saakashvili in the early 2000s. I think that she's been calling for the overthrow of Georgia Dream and claiming there was widespread Russian meddling in the October election, and has also said, I don't need to provide evidence of this. Now, I have referred to Georgia as the canary in one of the canaries in the coal mine of US imperialism. And I think that this is, you've got to bear in mind that Georgia was a huge project for the Americans and the Europeans. After the fall of communism, very pro-Western leader Eduard Shevardnadze took power, completely opened Georgia up to economic rape and pillage by the West, but also the co-option and infiltration of civil society by Western-funded NGOs. The US overthrew him, their own puppet, in 2003, and have effectively tried to turn Tbilisi into a perfect, unquestioning colony ever since. And that project, it has come skittering off the rails because, due to the US and EU backlash against the foreign transparency law, a large number of Georgians were confronted with the reality of their vassalage under Western hegemony and didn't like it at all. And so I think that, yes, that in the lead up to the October election, the Western pro-Western opposition and Western NGOs were claiming that Georgia Dream is going to steal it, and there were calls, once Georgia Dream won, for mass protest, mass strikes, a repeat of the NED CIA Rose Revolution in 2003. That fizzled out pretty much immediately. Right, and I saw a Western journalist posted a group of students who were sat sat outside a public building in Georgia, claiming that they were going to stay there all night in protest, and they said there were several students there. There was a grand total of 7. Like there was a group of 7 students who were protesting. That like this has fizzled out really rapidly. On screen now is a very fascinating, slick magazine produced by USAID called Democracy Rising, in which they describe how the US overthrew the government of Georgia and the government of Yugoslavia and Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan and Lebanon in color revolutions by backing the opposition. And this is just openly advertised that they did this. A far cry from today, when the NED involvement in Maidan is strenuously denied. But yes, like I think that if you think that the West spent untold sums and 35 years trying to turn Georgia decisively against Russia and into a effective Western puppet state, unquestioning, servile, and that's all been undone in a matter of months. I think that it is a cause for optimism throughout Central and Eastern Europe, because a similar dynamic and story played out all over the region. In Slovakia, as you and I have discussed, Slovakia was against EU and NATO membership. They refused to adopt neoliberal reforms. They got color revolutioned in the late 90s. There is a huge and growing anti-Western sentiment in these countries, and so much of so much of civil society and politics in these countries has been co-opted by Western powers. Actually, the reality of opinions of average people on the street is very much like opposed to Western domination, and yes, there is growing anti-EU and NATO sentiment across these countries, and this stuff can ratchet, and the entire project can unravel very quickly.
Yes. And this is, of course, the grim reality for the imperialists about when the Ukraine project falls apart. Because they managed 2 color revolutions in Ukraine, 2004, as that magazine that you shared from the mid-2000s makes clear. They were very much all in on the Orange Revolution. They were behind the Maidan. This has now led to this war, which will ultimately destroy the Kiev regime. And it will only encourage and strengthen those forces, even in the capitalist classes of Eastern and Central Europe, who decide that, well, we don't want that action. We don't want to be fed into this meat grinder by the US and the British. So therefore, at the very least, you'll see more figures like Viktor Orban appear, who is a reactionary in many respects, but who wants to position Hungary in a position where they can do business with both sides at the very least, and not just become a slave and a servant to a declining US empire. So that is going to be a very dangerous precedent to be set, especially for the British, to bring this episode to a close where we began, because without that ability to leverage the US's role and without the ability to exercise their own influence via cultural and educational domination, then Britain is very much, the British ruling class is very much screwed, because there's not a lot else that they've got going on anymore. So this is like the emergence of the multipolar world, as I've said on many occasions, represents a break with the past 30 years. It represents pretty much the ending point, or the marked decline of the British and the American order that's run the world arguably for 200 years. And this is the point where things fall to pieces. Final word on this to you, Kit.
Hooray! But I do think that, yeah, I mean, as bleak as like a lot of this stuff is, I mean, at the same time, yeah, that like we should we should remain cautiously optimistic, because yes, this stuff can come apart at the seams very rapidly without much in the way of advanced warning, but also often like relatively bloodlessly. I mean, I am always reminded of when I visited Vietnam as part of my kind of communist Hajj a few years back, and I travelled around in Ho Chi Minh City. I spent a day exploring the vast presidential palace that they had built, and I could imagine Kissinger swanning around this vast grand building at night, and yeah, I mean, this was built in the expectation that a puppet government would be created there and would exist in perpetuity, and then actually everyone's fleeing fleeing via helicopter and queuing on the roof to get out. We saw that in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan has completely dropped off the radar, although is now open to tourism, and is very welcoming of Western tourists.
And
interestingly,
the Russians have just passing a bill through the Duma to declare the Taliban is no longer a terrorist organization, following a meeting between Taliban leaders and Sergei Shoigu. So the Taliban is getting included in the Eurasian economic sphere, and the Chinese and the Russians will do business there. And what you will find is all the things that the Westerners said they were concerned about, but really weren't, like women's rights and stuff like that. The development of industry in Afghanistan via Russia, China, and probably Iran will actually break down the backwardness in Afghanistan in a way that, of course, the Americans and the British had no interest in doing at all.
Yes. Well, I was exactly going to say this as well. Is that like on top of the fact that Afghanistan has kind of dropped off the radar, they are building very close alliances with the Chinese and the Russians. The Chinese and the Russians are doing this all over the world, with very little in the way of media coverage or basic analysis of the seismic changes that are being brought by this. I interviewed a Senegalese academic recently called Ndongo Sambo-Silla, who wrote this excellent free to access paper called The Crisis of French Imperialism in Africa, about how countries like Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso were building were removing themselves from imperial structures, were booting out foreign, largely French and American troops, and forging fruitful alliances with BRICS countries. Again, like, these are countries that have, while a lot of blood has been shed, bringing them into the Western fold and keeping them there. Actually, when it comes to it, the empire is backing off, often without a shot fired. You know, and I think, and I there was something I wanted to get into last week, and maybe we'll discuss it next week. But it's like, you know, the in terms of fantasy meeting reality, it has been widely reported that the Britain's flagship aircraft carriers, the HMS Queen Elizabeth and the HMS Prince of Wales, are going to be mothballed. They're going to be scrapped, and it's like, you know, these were what I remember the hype around their launch in 2017 and 2019 respectively, and how this was Britain was going to rule the waves for decades as a result, and they were going to travel to every ocean in the world, and this was going to be this revolutionary change in how the quote unquote international rules-based order was going to be policed, with Britain at the forefront. And now, after not working really for 5 years or 7 years in the case of HMS Queen Elizabeth, and not being involved in any serious deployments, and suffering all manner of technical and mechanical issues, and often traveling around without any fighter jets on them at all, therefore defeating their entire purpose, they're being scrapped. That is a defeat. That is a defeat for British imperialism and the Royal Navy without a shot being fired.
Yes.
So remember, and I will never tire of this. We mentioned the Taliban. They rather famously informed an American official, "You have watches, we have time."
Indeed.
You know, so like yes, there was that. Rather on the money Onion headline, which is CIA exposes China's grand plan to just sit back and watch the US collapse. I think that we could all benefit from, you know, not encouraging these people by listening to them, voting for them, and just carrying on and building our own political structures and alliances, and waiting for their inevitable demise.
One day, Kit, we will see the British ruling elite, because it's actually quite a small number of people who consist of that, leaving the top of Buckingham Palace to get on a helicopter to go to Florida. And that moment will be a great day, the liberation of the homeland itself. Right, we'll bring it to a close for today. We will return to you, of course, next week, dear viewers, and thanks to 453 of you watching at the moment on various different platforms. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Be sure to read Kit's latest articles, including one on the decline of the British naval power, which we will link to in the when we publicise this further. Kit, anything else you want to give a shout out to before we close out for today?
No, I think that was an absolutely brilliant show. Thank you for joining us, boys and girls. Yeah, it's been real. Please like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your grandparents. That's a demographic we're aiming for, as well as the youth of today. So yeah, no, it's been real. Let's see you next week. God bless you. Take care.
See you, everybody. All right, here we go. So that's it for this week with another episode of Decline and Fall. Join us again at the same time next week, where we will be discussing further evidence of the decline and fall of the Anglo-American Empire. But until then, I'm going to throw you back over to your musical accompaniment. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. Thanks to our moderator, Jenny, who's been on the scene in the chat. And I will return to you again tomorrow.
Как крайний, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Моя родная, заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, отдых и на труд.